This exciting story began in a deep yusu, where the girl sat and sorted through her plants. She took with her a special watering can to water them, as well as some seeds to plant new ones. The sun was already quite high. Therefore, it was very hot on her head. After several hours of planting, she finally stopped and decided that this should have been enough for her, so she decided not to plant the rest of the seeds. Of course, she was very surprised, because she couldn't even imagine that she could somehow get away from the villagers. However, when she looked at what she had planted, she was no longer sure whether she had done it correctly at all, since they did not look the best. Then the girl stood up and realized that she really didn't know why she was putting up with all this. However, she didn't want to fight in any way. But in fact, even after such a long time, it was difficult for her to believe that she had transformed into a character from a fantasy novel called Radiana. And of all times, she became very famous, because she was a villain from a ruined noble family, and this is exactly the kind of character the girl became. Of course, as soon as she was reincarnated, she could not believe that she could become the only daughter of Viscount Lawton, Elia. She had dazzling dresses and new hair that looked like a solar bat. She also had incredibly clear sky blue eyes and a clear nose, as well as plump lips that attracted many men. Elia was the daughter of an inconspicuous family of viscounts. However, her appearance was truly unique, so she always attracted a lot of attention. However, her character was simply a sadist who only appeared on a few pages of the novel, and nothing much was really known. The girl only knew that her nature was extremely vicious, and the only thing she was really good at was vegetation. She was very good at it. Quite. Naturally, people around had a bad opinion of Ela because they did not share her interests and way of life. To top it all off, her family soon even went bankrupt, and all this because they had a habit of stretching the Viscount and his daughter Ellie. And when soon their family's wealth simply evaporated, the Viscount took up gambling, because he believed that in this way he could regain his former glory. Burdened with enormous debts, he abandoned Elio and fled alone, considering her only a difficulty in his path. And this was the moment when the girl was transformed into the body of this very character. As soon as Elia opened her eyes, she realized that she was in a completely unknown area and did not know what to do. She was in a panic. It was then that she felt that something was seriously wrong. The girl went to the window and saw a very large crowd of people shouting and holding torches in their hands. She knew they were hostile because they were shouting Viscount Ellie's name and telling her to come out immediately because they wanted to deal with her, otherwise it would only get worse for her. They also addressed her father directly and said that if they had not gone out together, they would have sold the girl to a slave trader. Ely was confused. She didn't understand what was happening there at all. However, she understood perfectly well that she had to leave that place immediately because it would definitely not end well. And right at that moment, as soon as she took over this case, she became a fugitive without a penny, which was, and also pursued by collectors. So when Elia was able to find the back door and escape, she felt incredibly relieved because she hadn't caught their eye and she had more time to run away. And in order to hide from the eyes of the collectors, she ran and hid in this remote mountain village that few people had ever heard of. It was such a secluded place that no strangers would visit, and besides all this, all the villagers were very kind, so Ellie actually decided to just stay there. The girl thought that this was the best option for her. Of course, she was very exhausted because she had been planting various plants for several hours in a row, and therefore decided to take a short break to catch her breath. When the girl returned to her hut and lay down on the bed, she breathed a sigh of relief. She assumed that it was probably because her original body was very strong. However, when she reincarnated into this one, she felt tired, even though she had not moved much. For her, it was just terrible, because in her real body she was really very strong and could withstand various trainings for a long time. Even after quite a long period of time, she could not get used to this difference, and when she did heavy loads, she got tired very quickly and very much, which was not good for her productivity. And when she looked at the roof, she even saw several rather large holes. She realized that she would still need to somehow patch them up. The girl, because she was very tired, decided to take a nap. And as soon as she closed her eyes, she immediately fell into a deep sleep. But she woke up quite quickly because she heard some strange sounds coming from the window. Coming closer then, she realized that they looked like something very heavy had fallen to the ground. However, she could not see anything from such a distance, so she decided to go outside and check. The girl armed herself with a stick in case she had to defend herself and went outside in the hope that it was just an animal. When she turned the corner, she suddenly saw some grown man who was beating the poor boy really badly. She didn't understand who this man even was. However, the man shouted loudly at the boy and continued to beat him. The girl was very scared. She didn't understand what was happening and thought this man was completely crazy. She couldn't believe that he, being a real adult, took and beat a child. Then she came closer and swung her stick at him and addressed him, calling him a crazy idiot. She was ready to hit him for the way he treated the poor child. But the man managed to turn his head to the side in time. He pointed his hand towards her, and suddenly some black shadows began to spin around the girl. The guy really didn't expect that she could approach him. Not understanding who this girl was, he decided to immediately defend himself because he didn't know what danger she could pose. But the girl, as soon as she saw these shadows, froze in horror. She did not understand where they came from and what they started. But the unknown madman, smiling happily, said that her end had come. The girl was very scared and decided to close her eyes in the hope that she would not have to see this. However, when after some time nothing happened, she opened one eye to check what had happened. When the girl did this, the man suddenly looked very scared and did not understand why his magic did not work at all. But the girl, she didn't lose her head. She immediately asked if he really thought that all these strange things of his could work. Of course, she didn't even understand that he was capable of it, but she decided to keep herself in hand. After this, the girl turned her gaze to a little boy who was sitting nearby and crying loudly. Ellie immediately approached him and tried to calm him down. She understood that she did not have time at all to deal with this man. She had to take care of the child. Stroking his back, she asked in a worried voice if everything was okay with him, and also if he was seriously injured after the blows that the man had committed. Meanwhile, the stranger himself continued to release various shadows from himself and could not understand why it did not work. He looked at his hands with alarm and said that this had never happened to him before. Then he turned to the girl, asking what she was like that for. But Elle continued to yell at him, ignoring his words, and immediately asking who he was that he dared to raise his hand against a defenseless little child. She looked at him with a look that was completely filled with hatred, because she truly felt incredible disgust for this man. Ellie sighed heavily and began to get up from her seat, taking a stick in her hands, and said that such a crazy idiot as he needed to be punished with the same methods. So she hit him with all her might right in the face, saying that he was just a disgusting person and didn't deserve to exist. Some time passed from that moment. The girl beat him with a stick several more times, and he was already lying unconscious. She looked at him with a slightly calmer look and thought that he was not as brave as he tried to be. After that, she turned him over and thought that, in any case, he was abusing the child, so he deserved it. And when Elle checked to see if he was unconscious, she returned to this little boy again and immediately addressed him. The child cried without stopping all the time, and as soon as she approached him, he began to cry even more. The girl tried to calm him down and said that everything was okay now, he was safe, and also suggested that he must have been very scared. She hugged this child, taking him on her lap, and said that he didn't need to cry anymore. Everything was calm and good. She could take care of him and protect him if anything happened. Some time passed from that moment, and the boy continued to cry. However, soon he suddenly calmed down, and looking at her or directly into her eyes, called her his mother. Hearing this girl was genuinely surprised. She did not expect to hear this, so she even gasped loudly. When some time had passed, or she led this man through the forest and stopped at the top of the mountain in order to rest at least a little, because he was really very heavy. The girl caught her breath and did not understand what he could have eaten to have such a large body mass. She had always been quite strong, and therefore now it was incredibly difficult for her. However, as she wiped the sweat from her face, she thought that she had brought him to quite a distance, so she believed that everything should have been fine. She also thought that if she left him like that, he might wake up and do something strange again, but she would already be far away. At that moment, Ely suddenly noticed his tattoo, which was on the back of his head, and immediately realized that it was like some kind of symbol. Of course, Elle immediately became wary when she saw him. However, she decided that it didn't concern her at all, so she simply left him there and left. When some more time passed, or she finally returned to her hut, she left the child there before taking the man as far away as possible. When the girl went inside, she didn't notice him right away, so she loudly addressed the boy and asked where he had gone. The child was not going to answer her because he was still very scared, and she was a little worried because she was sure that she had put him to bed before leaving. Well, as soon as she approached the desk, she immediately saw this boy, who was sitting with his knees pulled closer and even shaking a little with fear. She moved the table to the other side and, smiling happily, turned to the boy, asking if he was still scared. The guy didn't expect that she would find him, so he screamed loudly and was ready to cry again. Then Eli thought about the fact that he had chosen a rather strange place to hide, so she decided that he wanted to be more careful. She also thought about the fact that most likely he called her mom when he was in a dream because the boy was under a lot of stress, so he did just that. When Elle didn't move away from him, she simply looked at him for a while, and after a while, she asked if he would like to have a little snack, since the road was long after all. The boy did not refuse, so when some time passed, the girl prepared dinner for them. Eli set the table, and they sat down opposite each other. She had prepared a very nice soup. When they tried it, the girl became alarmed and asked if he liked it, since she didn't know what his food preferences were. The boy was laconic due to the stress he had been through. However, he said it was simply delicious and thanked her for the food. However, Ellie wondered if there was a similar situation in the original story. She definitely couldn't remember anything like that, so she was even a little worried. The girl even suggested that perhaps this child was also an additional character, about whom very little was said in the novel. In order to narrow down the circle of suspects a little, she decided to ask his name. The boy, who had already begun to settle in little by little, immediately called him he was a rayon. Ellie immediately smiled and said that he had a very beautiful name, and also gave her own. The name was unfamiliar to her, so she assumed that he was most likely just an additional unfamiliar character, just like her. She decided to ask Ryan about various information and asked where his parents were at home and if they had looked for him. But the boy, as soon as he heard these questions, immediately could not hold back his tears and burst into tears. Ellie felt very uncomfortable because of this, since she understood that it was her fault. She actually couldn't even imagine that this could hurt him so much, so she understood that she needed to somehow resolve this situation, so the girl got up from her seat. Ryan very quickly and hugged him tightly, gently stroking his head so that he would calm down little by little. Then the guy, continuing to cry, said that it was too scary, as if he was terrified, and also it was very painful for him. Ellie was quite patient, so she said that she understood everything, and also suggested that it must have been very difficult for him all this time. Ryan, who was gradually calming down, replied that he was sleeping in his room, and then a man suddenly appeared and kidnapped him. And then he did something disgusting. The boy didn't want to talk about it with his parents anymore, so Ellie decided to cheer him up and said that he was very brave and acted quite confidently. The girl said that she was genuinely proud of him and replied that he was really brave to have been able to survive all of that. Wiping away his tears that were running down his cheeks, she asked if she could look at his brave face. Ryan didn't object. Little by little, he began to calm down and looked at her with his big blue eyes. She then said that she would like to say something about his house. The boy, hearing this, immediately became interested and asked what exactly. And Ellie replied that even if she knew where this place was, she didn't think she could take him there, so she wanted to ask his forgiveness in advance. She explained that this village was located very deep in the mountains, and it was very difficult to get anywhere from there. The girl stood up, stroked his head, and said that she was absolutely sure that his parents were looking for him, so until then, he could calmly stay with her. Ryan heard. It just shone with joy, because this girl sank into his soul and seemed very kind. Then he asked, could he really stay? Ellie smiled and said that, of course it was so. Then he ran up and hugged her again. In fact, she lived alone for so long, and that's why she was a little lonely. So she also found positive aspects in this situation and decided that at least she wouldn't be so bored. Several days passed since then, and Ellie got ready to go to the village for a while. She went outside, said goodbye to the boy, and told him to keep a close eye on their house. Ryan started to object to me. Then the girl went on this trip and thought about the fact that she really hoped that it just seemed to her that they were quickly running out of gradients. Living with the child in the last few days was not particularly difficult, as she got used to his existence quite quickly, and even forgot what it was like to be alone. He behaved very well and was ready to cooperate with her, so there were no problems with communication between the two of them. However, there was also one thing that bothered her greatly, and that was that he avoided the topic of his status in society whenever she brought it up. And it was for this reason that she didn't know how to address him correctly. But she didn't know. Was it really necessary to directly demand these answers from him? Ellie understood perfectly well that extra pressure on the boy could be very unpleasant, so she decided to just let this situation go for a while. And when she finally reached the village, she was a little surprised, because everything there was a little different. The girl approached one of the passers-by and asked if something was really happening, since everyone around was always in a hurry and even looked worried. Then the woman she turned to said that knights had come earlier, and they said that the Duke's son had been kidnapped by a magician, and now he was missing, so they searched the entire village. As soon as Elle heard this, she was genuinely surprised. She couldn't believe that this really happened. Then the man spoke up and said that too. They were able to find the kidnapper, or someone who knew something about this information, somewhere in the forest. The woman said it was just awful, and she found it hard to even imagine what could happen to that child now. And Eli, laughing nervously, adjusted her bag on her shoulder and said that it really was quite strange, and also added that a lot of different things had been happening lately. In fact, Ellie knew very well that there was only one duke in that empire. He was a master in both academic achievements and swordsmanship. He was also very good at fencing, and also had an impeccable appearance. He was highly praised for his excellence in every field he attempted. And ever since he inherited the title of Duke, the Emperor of the Rotonian Empire, Ivan Ricardo, treated him differently. And the more the Duke got involved with the main character of the icy blonde woman, the stronger the Emperor's interference in their lives became. The Duke would do anything for the main woman he loved with all his heart. However, he could never win her. His obsession with this lady was so great that he was ready to commit a crime without hesitation, and since he was the second main male character, he was doomed from the very beginning. Ellie thought about this for quite a long time, even after she had returned home and was baking cookies with the boy. Ryan immediately suspected something and asked the girl after some time of addressing her if everything was okay with her, because she did not listen to him at all. He also said that if she was so tired, they could bake cookies and bread a little later. But Ellie immediately smiled and said that it was not necessary to do that. She was completely fine. She just wanted to finish the bread as quickly as possible so that they could eat it. The boy, smiling happily, said that he would also like to try it soon. And the girl also asked if they should put it in the oven right then. Ryan smiled happily and said that he thought it was time to do it, so he suggested doing it sooner rather than later. At that moment, the doors to her hut opened very sharply, and several armed and armored warriors ran in. They shouted loudly and pointed their guns towards the girl and said that they had found Lord Ryan. At that moment, the girl hugged the boy very tightly so that he would not be afraid and to protect him if anything happened. And these strangers in turn shouted loudly and said that it was necessary to immediately arrest this girl because she was the kidnapper. Ellie was very scared. She didn't understand what to do, and because of this she was even confused. The girl had never been in such situations before. Some time passed from that moment, and before I even had time to come to my senses, I was already sitting in a carriage with my mouth tied. They drove quite a long distance, and Ryan hugged her and cried the whole time. He tried to prove to the people who were also sitting in the carriage that she was not a kidnapper. She really only helped him. The knights, when they finally arrived, opened the doors and tried to get Ryan out of there. They said it was time for him to leave and asked him to come over. However, the boy burst into tears even more. He squeezed the girl's waist tighter and was not going to go anywhere because he was trying to prove that he was right. The knights were incredibly angry at this girl at that moment because they did not understand how much it was necessary to brainwash this small and unfortunate child. Ellie actually turned away from them, realizing that she had done nothing at all. She had only tried to protect him, and what choice he had ultimately made was no longer her problem. Then one of the green-haired knights sighed heavily and said that they simply had no other choice. They told them to both get out of the carriage, at least like that, and the girl continues to hold Ryan's hand and still went outside and started to look around. Everything around. As soon as she looked at this incredibly beautiful estate, she immediately realized that this was the very place where the Duke lived and about which she had heard so much. This estate was really off the beaten track. It was very large, and it was obvious that it had been looked after. When they finally went inside, they immediately approached one office, and the knight knocked on the door. Ellie looked around all this time and tried to remember every detail. In fact, the exterior was really impressive. However, the interior was on a completely different level compared to the Viscount's mansion. The knight immediately turned to the Duke and said that they had caught the offender. The man who was on the other side of the door immediately allowed them to come in, and Ellie, hearing his voice, immediately became a little worried because it sounded scary. And as soon as she went inside, she immediately froze in place upon seeing this man. The man turned directly to the girl and asked if she was the same person who had kidnapped Ryan. This man had black hair with a blue tint that could be seen at the ends, as well as red eyes that looked more like blood. This man exuded a chilling aura that perfectly matched his sculpted facial features. It was Nathan, the very same Duke, and as soon as she saw him, he frowned and looked very unhappy. But at that moment, one of the knights suddenly pressed so hard on her shoulders that she simply had to fall to her knees in front of him. Then the man left his place, and approaching her closer, asked why Ryan was next to this woman. The knight explained that he simply refused to leave her side, and they even suggested that she might have used mind control magic on him, since he found this behavior rather suspicious. As soon as Ellie saw the look of this Duke, 1,000 goosebumps ran through her body. She even thought that he could kill someone just by looking. After a short silence, Kaiden asked how much money she planned to take for the ransom of this boy. He tore the bandage off her mouth and said that her family was at rock bottom, so he believed that she was desperate to survive by any means necessary, and that was why she committed such a terrible act. However, he leaned down closer to her in order to look her straight in the eyes and said that she had chosen the wrong target, so she had definitely miscalculated. Ellie was shocked to hear this. She couldn't believe that he was actually able to conduct a comprehensive investigation in such a short time. She understood that there was no point in remaining silent. Therefore, sighing heavily, the girl said that this was all just a huge misunderstanding, and she would like to explain the situation as it was. Ellie explained that she barely managed to escape from the debt collectors and managed to find a quiet place to live when suddenly the very man who kidnapped Ryan appeared right in front of her. Kaiden, hearing this, immediately looked at her with alarm and asked if this thief, by fate and chance, really did appear right in front of her. A note of distrust could be heard in his voice. He looked at the girl again with disgust. He asked her, was that really all she could say in her defense? Ellie screamed loudly. She wanted to say something else, but she didn't have time because he told her to shut her mouth. If she wanted to know what was best for her, he advised her to really not say such things again if she valued her tongue. However, at that moment, Ryan suddenly walked up to his father and covered his mouth with his hand. Everyone around was immediately surprised, and the boy, speaking loudly, said that his father should not say such terrible things, and also said that he had a cruel mouth. The Duke immediately looked at one of the knights and asked them to take Ryan out of this room, as this sight was definitely not for his age. The knight immediately came up and took Ryan in his arms and began to lead him out of the room. The boy resisted, cried, and beat him with his hands all this time. However, it was all useless. When the doors finally closed, Ellie thought that she had already told this idiot that she hadn't done anything, so she didn't understand what else he wanted from her. Soon, due to the fact that she really did not say anything else, the girl was moved to prison because they considered her guilty of everything. She sat in the corner of her cell with a chain on her leg and cried. And all the while she was literally dying of hunger, because she hadn't eaten for a very long time. Eli assumed that half a day had already passed since she had been locked up all alone in that terrible place. When she was still in the Duke's office, he asked what exactly she had done to Ryan. that made him behave like that. The girl did not understand why he was so persistent and repeated again that she did nothing, and also asked the Duke. Was he really so sure that she could be involved in all this? Kaiden, hearing about all this, became even more angry and asked if she had any other excuses. Ellie, who continued to sit on her knees, then told him that this was not the only reason why he brought her to this place and did not throw her straight into prison. And she asked if it was true that they had no evidence. The man began to get even more angry, but the girl did not back down. She said that he brought her to his office so that she would tell and show real evidence so that he would have grounds for a legal arrest. Of course, it was just her guess. However, she knew she had to voice it, so she plucked up the courage and told him those words. Kaiden looked at her, without taking his eyes off her, and said that it seemed to him that she was not as stupid as they said about her out loud. After that, he ordered the guard to throw her into the dungeon. And indeed, from that moment on, she did not have time to say a single word, but simply found herself in a terrible, dirty, cold, and lonely dungeon. Or she kept remembering how Ryan cried when he was led out of the room, and it made her feel so much pain in her soul. In fact, she didn't know much information about Ryan. Technically speaking, he was a child. However, his biological father was not the Duke. He was born to Duke Burke's sister Nathan and her lover Liam Herman. After an unfortunate incident claimed the lives of the Burkes, Nathan and Lem left poor Dane alone, and so the Duke took him in. And since the Duke was very caring towards his sister, there was no way that he would not be able to take care of her son. When Eli remembered everything that was said in the books, she remembered that he was insanely devoted. However, Ellie felt her body somehow differently. It was surprisingly very heavy, and she even assumed that because of everything that happened, she might have developed a fever. When she touched her forehead, she felt a strong heat. She realized that she was getting really hot and assumed that her temperature had risen. Soon after this, one of the knights came down to her dungeon and, opening the doors to her cell, told her to come out. He explained that the Duke had called her, so she had to go upstairs. As soon as Ellie heard this, she was very surprised and even assumed that in such a short time he had managed to assign her a punishment. But when she went upstairs, Ryan was there too, and the man asked her to put him to bed. Ellie heard. This was very surprised and asked what he meant. The Duke simply repeated the same phrase, but the girl still did not understand why he asked her about this, and Kaiden sighed heavily and said that she really was simply unbearable. He also said that if she ever tried to do something stupid with Ryan, she definitely wouldn't get away with it, and she should remember that. At that moment, the guard grabbed her hand and started putting something on her. Then she saw a small bracelet with a red stone on it, and when Elia asked what it was, the Duke replied that if she was so interested, she could ignore his warning and try her luck. The girl was a little wary. She understood that whatever it was clearly not a simple object, so she had to be very careful. At that moment, Kaiden suddenly turned around and started to leave. He said that she would find out about her punishment the next morning, and until then, she could at least rest a little. Before leaving the room, he looked at her one last time and told her to stay put and not to do anything stupid for her own happiness. After that, he simply closed the door. When night came and Ellie helped Raya, but to do all the evening procedures, they lay down in the same bed, and the girl decided to ask him about everything. When the boy told her everything that had happened, she became alarmed and asked if he had really cried for 6 hours because he wanted to stay with her. The boy didn't see anything wrong with it, so he just said that it really was like that. He didn't want anything bad to happen to her either, and he wanted her to be there. Eli immediately asked if it was too exhausting. Then she stroked his cheek and said that his beautiful face was all swollen because of it. But the guy replied that everything was fine. However, lowering his head, he said that she was not the kidnapper, so he did not understand why no one believed them. The girl, laughing nervously, said that perhaps they simply thought that she had somehow persuaded him. The Duke and the knights all thought so, but Ryan, hearing this, said that it was wrong. She didn't do anything like that. She just took care of him all this time. Elle sighed heavily and said that this made the situation even more annoying, so there was nothing they could do about it. They just had to accept the situation. But the boy at that moment became even more upset. He burst into tears again and asked for forgiveness, saying that it was all his fault and he was very sorry that it happened. Elia took his hand and said in a gentle voice that it was not his fault at all. It was all the adults who refused to believe them. They were the ones who were wrong. So she asked him not to worry about it. Some time passed from that moment. They discussed a few more issues. And well, the boy fell asleep pretty quickly. Elia lay opposite him and looked at how peacefully he was resting, and thought that when she looked at him up close, he looked even younger than his age. Because of this, the girl was a little sad. After all, when she first saw him, she thought that he could have been 5 or 6 years old. However, since she was still in the early period of the novel, he was about 8. Ryan suddenly started having a bad dream and crying, and the girl thought that in fact, according to the plot of the novel, he was much smaller in terms of development and growth than all the other children. The girl stroked his shoulder, trying to calm him down. She realized that last time he called her mom for some reason. She really hoped that now, when he mumbles something about mom in his sleep, it's just some kind of vision he's dreaming. She couldn't believe that he could miss his mother so much. After all, they hadn't lived together that long anyway. But he was in real despair. Closing her eyes, Elle suddenly became interested in what the Duke could say about her punishment. The next morning, she was able to fall asleep quite quickly and woke up early. The first thing she did early in the morning was go to the Duke's office, as he had immediately called her to say that the sentence had been passed. He threw several papers in her direction and told her in a rough voice to sign them. Eli was very surprised, and all because he pulled her out of bed at dawn and brought her to this place without explanation. And now, he even so pathetically threw the papers without even explaining anything. The girl was amazed by his ignorance. However, she came closer and began to study them carefully in order not to drive herself into a trap. The Duke said she must have known that refusal would have meant immediate imprisonment, so she really had no choice. However, Elle was not surprised, because it was everyone around her who told her to sign everything without questions, because it could only lead to worse consequences. However, when the girl began to read these papers, she realized that it was a contract, which stated that she was to take the position of caretaker. However, even an idiot could see that in reality it was about surveillance, and the duration of the contract was also indefinite. They planned to keep her there until all their suspicions were dispelled. Of course, having seen it, she was amazed by the girl. She could not believe that they could set such conditions for her. Of course, she didn't like it. However, she wasn't sure if she had any choice to refuse, so she decided to drag things out a bit and maybe find out a little more details. Ellie turned to the man and asked if this point was really real. The man did not understand what she was talking about, so he immediately asked again. Ellie no longer stood on ceremony. She turned the papers towards him and, shouting loudly, said that later the contract stated that the family had to pay off all her debts. And even there was a mention of double compensation. This particular point interested her very much. And the man, sighing heavily, said that it was so. However, she needed to remember that she also had one condition. This compensation was only applicable if she was cleared of all suspicion. But Ellie, knowing she was innocent, immediately signed these papers. She was well aware of what a wonderful chance this was for her, so putting the pen aside, she smiled happily. The girl smiled and said that she had signed everything, so from that moment on, they were now employees. Caden took the papers in his hands and immediately began to look at her signature and was very surprised. However, he looked at the girl and said that the butler should have explained all the other details to her. He also said in a rough voice that she had to leave immediately because he had other duties to do, and she was distracting him. Eli, without thinking twice, got up from her seat and left. In fact, when she looked at his expression, she realized that he thought that she had made her decision too hastily and signed these papers. But in fact, she was very interested when she saw it. This last condition, but there was also another reason why she signed this contract. The reason was that absolutely every one of the children borrowed money from the district printing guild. Their main business was lending money. Lend, and they did not hesitate when it came to inhumane methods of collection. And life in the Duke's estate would be much better for her than if she were caught by the district guild and simply sold into slavery. Of course, when she was constantly under surveillance, it was very unpleasant. However, she did not kidnap this child, so she really thought that everything would be just fine in the end. More importantly for her, she also had a good idea of who could be behind all this, since she had read the novel and remembered it well. Ellie assumed that it could be a rival of the Duke, someone who constantly sought to undermine his authority, and this person could be the Marquis of Passion d'Or. At that moment, as the guards were taking the girl to the butler, she finally saw him, and the man bowed and said that his name was Albert Butler. The man also said that he was very glad to meet her. The girl reciprocated and gave her name. The man Rada, smiling again, said that he knew about it very well because the Duke had already informed him about everything in advance. After some time, he brought her to the second floor and said that this was her room. He also explained that she did not have to do any chores around the house, since it was not her responsibility. Albert told the girl that her only duty was to stay by Ryan's side and fulfill his every request. In addition, the butler also said that starting from lunch, she had to go down to the dining room for a general meal and never be late. At the same time, the man gave her a short tour of the castle, and Ellie, hearing all this, immediately asked, did she really have to go to the dining room alone? Albert replied that this was not true. She should have come there with Ryan since she was now his nanny. The man also said that if the Dukes did not have important and urgent matters at any given moment, then she would also dine with him. And when the girl heard this, it was a real shock for her, and even disappointment to some extent. She did not understand why this catastrophe happened to her. In a trembling voice, she asked if she really had not heard correctly, and he said that she should dine with the Duke. Albert replied that this was indeed so. He explained that it was a direct order from the Duke. Therefore, she had no right to refuse. She simply had to strictly carry out her duties and requests. Ellie wasn't thrilled about this new development at all. However, she just hoped that it wouldn't make her lose her appetite. Some time passed from that moment. She spent all this time with Ryan, and when it was time for lunch, she went down to the dining room with the boy. The Duke was already sitting at the table, and then they began their meal. And then, everyone felt very uncomfortable and awkward. She did not understand whether this was a canteen or a prison, because the atmosphere was indeed very tense and nervous. Looking at the Duke, she couldn't understand. Did the people in that place really always eat in silence? Was it some kind of personal tradition of theirs? Then suddenly, Ryan turned to Ela and asked if she really didn't want to eat, since the girl hadn't even taken a bite of her lunch all this time. The girl immediately said that of course she was hungry, and handing him a fork with salad, asked if he would also like to try a little of her dish. The boy happily agreed, and as soon as she began to bring the fork to her mouth, the Duke suddenly hit the table with his hand very hard and said that this was a very absurd sight. The man he did not understand. Why did she do such actions at all, knowing that it contradicted absolutely all the rules of their house? And Elia thought that he was going a bit too far, because she hadn't done anything forbidden. The atmosphere around her became even more hostile. However, then she suddenly thought about why she was worried about his reaction at all, because it was stupid on her part. She suddenly frowned deeply and realized that she had done nothing wrong, so she should not have reacted to his remark. Caden was looking at the girl even more angrily at that moment, and she thought that because of that expression on his face, someone was definitely going to die. She still found it very difficult to believe that a man with such a hostile expression in his eyes could ultimately fall in love with the main character of the story and show sincere and kind feelings towards her. She also wondered if she could or see how those eyes. One day they would warm up because now it didn't seem so at all. She had no idea how this could have happened, so she decided to change the subject of their conversation and turned to Ryan and asked if he enjoyed it. The boy, smiling happily, said that it was really magnificent, and after some time, the plates of all three were empty, and the Duke decided to be the first to leave their company. The man got up from his seat without even saying goodbye. He just left. For Eli, this behavior was simply terrible. She did not understand how he could finish eating and just leave without saying a single word, considering the fact that he did not even say anything during dinner. When he went out the door, Ellie also stood up from her seat and asked the boy if he would like to go out too. Rayon, smiling happily, said that this was indeed the case, because his stomach was already absolutely full, and he definitely would not be able to eat anything more. When the girl stood up, She thought about whether she had eaten enough, but at that moment, her head suddenly began to spin very strongly. She didn't understand at all what had happened, because everything was swimming before her eyes, and her head was hurting really badly. In order not to lose her balance, she leaned her hand on the table and breathed very heavily. Ryan immediately ran up to Ella and asked if she was feeling ill, and he asked in an anxious voice what he needed to do. The girl at that moment tried to come to her senses. She did not understand. Why did it happen so suddenly, and was very upset that it happened right in front of the child. The Duke, who at that moment had not yet fully left and heard some loud sounds outside the door, immediately returned back and saw that Ellie had begun to lose consciousness. Of course, he immediately became very scared. And Ellie did not understand what was happening to her, because yesterday everything was fine with her, and in the morning she felt fine. However, the girl fell to the ground rather quickly. Ryan immediately ran up to her. He screamed loudly and even burst into tears because he was incredibly scared for her. At that moment, Ellie opened her eyes and found herself in a completely unknown place. Everything around was dark, and under her feet, there was a feeling as if there was water. Very distantly, she could hear someone talking, but she couldn't understand where they were coming from. The girl walked a few steps forward and began to hear these voices louder. Then she saw the Duke in front of her, and next to him stood a figure of a man. However, because this man was wearing a cloak, she could not see who exactly it was. Ellie immediately recognized the Duke and did not understand what he was doing there at all. The man looked rather worried and was trying to prove something to the person standing next to him. She tried to understand who was standing next to him and did not understand why he looked so serious, and she could not understand the conversation. The words seemed to blur in her head. Because of this, she became very sad. However, then, after the man said something to the person standing next to him, he suddenly began to pull the head of this person in order to kiss. Elia was very scared. She couldn't believe that this was really a scene from the original story, and she turned away so as not to be embarrassed even more. However, the girl was incredibly alarmed by this. She did not understand. Why did she see all this? However, at that moment, hair could be seen from under the cloak. She looked more closely, and at that moment, the man removed her hood, and Ellie saw herself. The girl certainly didn't expect to see this, and couldn't believe that it was really true. But immediately after such a shock, she woke up. The girl screamed very loudly. However, when she opened her eyes, she noticed that the picture she saw had changed, and now she was in the bedroom. The girl sat up in bed and immediately realized that it was just a bad dream. However, she could not believe that she could dream something like that, or even thought that this world really had come to an end, since she could have such dreams. But at the same moment, when the girl sat up on the bed, she heard Ryan's voice, who with tears in his eyes turned to her and asked if everything was okay with her. Behind the girl also saw the Duke with the doctor. The boy immediately threw himself into her arms and continued to cry very loudly, but now from happiness. Ellie was shocked. She didn't understand what was happening. It took her some time to remember what happened before she lost consciousness. She remembered that she fainted right in front of Raya immediately after lunch, and it was a really shocking event for the boy. The Duke approached the girl and said that it had been a whole day and a half since she had been unconscious. Ellie, hearing this, immediately looked at him in surprise and asked, was it really true? Because for her it was something unreal. Kaiden pulled his son away from the girl so that she could at least come to her senses a little. The man, hugging him, immediately said that all this time she was unconscious, and of course they began to worry a little, thinking that something bad had happened to her. Ellie, hearing this, was immediately very surprised and asked, did this really mean that she was seriously ill, since she had been in a coma for so long? She even thought that it was most likely just fatigue and lack of sleep that caused her to simply not stand it and her body to switch off. Then the doctor entered the conversation and told the girl that she had gotten a little better. However, she still had some fever. Therefore, she needed to take medication for a few more days. The girl, hearing this, immediately thanked him and said that of course she would take these medications. Kaiden then turned to the doctor and asked what was the likelihood that this could also be passed on to his son. The man replied that he thought it was hardly contagious, so they had no reason to worry. His boy was perfectly safe. The Duke at that moment handed his son over to the maids and said that, nevertheless, they could not be absolutely calm, and therefore asked them to take him away and examine him carefully. Ryan, of course, immediately began to get indignant. He burst into tears and said that he wanted to be near Ellie and did not want to go anywhere. Then the girl entered the conversation directly, and she said that she did not know what was happening. However, she asked if the Duke could not send him for examination a little later. But the man got even more angry because of this. He looked at her with a stern look and asked why she was now indicating what he needed to do. It was very suspicious. As soon as she heard this phrase, she immediately understood that he meant that she had no right to interfere in his affairs. However, she realized that she could not do anything more, because it would only make things worse for her. She felt very sorry because she wanted to help Ryan, but the boy with tears in his eyes still left the room, and when the man and the girl were alone, he asked her if she really thought she could completely capture his son with such a ridiculous trick. Ellie, hearing this, was very indignant. She said that she did not understand at all what he was talking about, just like the last time when he hinted at something to her. But the Duke was very pleased with himself. He smiled maliciously and said that she was again pretending that she didn't know anything, and he also asked her to stop playing these ridiculous roles, because he understood everything perfectly well anyway. He said that she was a person who was downright greedy and was driven only by the lust for money, so cruelty was second nature to her in his opinion. He also replied that it couldn't be that the water just came from his son's messenger without any hidden motive, and asked if she really thought that it wasn't true. The girl didn't react to this at all. She just stood and looked at him. Of course, she couldn't answer him anything, because she knew that he wouldn't believe her anyway. So she just didn't see the point in all this. The Duke, meanwhile, came closer to her and, grabbing her by the shoulders, said that if she thought that he did not know that she was working with that scoundrel, then in that case she was a real idiot. Hearing, this girl got scared, and the man continued to shout and said that Ryan was the truth. He believed that she saved him. He didn't even understand that this was an action disguised as an accident. The man, meanwhile, was incredibly strongly pressing on her hand. She tried to get out. However, everything was unsuccessful, and the girl asked why he did this to her. And this one screamed, even louder, and asked if she was really going to continue pretending that she didn't know about the curse that was placed on her body. Hearing this phrase, the girl was genuinely surprised. She did not understand what kind of curse was being discussed, and simply froze in place from shock. She, lowering her head down, thought that his conversations made no sense, no matter how much she explained. He did not believe her, so she did not know what else to say in such a situation. So Ellie waved her hand and told him to just forget about it and think what he wanted to think. She wasn't even going to explain anything because she simply didn't see the point. The Duke, moving away from her, said that for him, this meant that she had finally confessed to the accusations, and therefore he no longer had to waste time. Joy, but smiling, he said that it didn't matter at all whether they had a contract or not. He was now going to just throw her in jail. But Eli, raising her voice, asked, didn't he understand that if he was going to live filled with mistrust, then everyone would eventually just abandon him, and when he was left alone, he would simply die completely alone, since no one else would support or understand him. Ellie said that he was like a light bulb that had gone out, forgotten somewhere in the attic. The man had nothing to say, so for some time they were in complete silence. She immediately thought that she had overreacted a little, because in her irritation she had said, without thinking, many things that she had not even intended to. But the man, without saying a single word, simply turned around and left, slamming the door very loudly behind him. Ellie was shocked. She just sat for a while and looked at the closed door, not understanding what had happened. She couldn't even imagine that he wouldn't react to it in any way. The girl assumed that he was simply shocked by the way she said it. So I decided that there was nothing wrong with it, and most likely he just decided not to develop this topic further, and so he left without saying anything to her in response. But when some time passed, or suddenly thought about what exactly she said, and immediately realized that this is exactly what the main character from the original Radiana said to the Duke right in the face. Of course, the girl felt very awkward and ashamed about this, and in fact, when the Duke heard these words in the original story, He became obsessed with the girl and pursued her everywhere. Elle sighed heavily and realized that she had no choice. She had to somehow resolve this situation. But she also really hoped that the Duke wouldn't become obsessed with her because she said that phrase. She decided that it was all meant to be. It's a good thing Ellie was a minor character with a very minor role in the novel, so he definitely shouldn't have been fixated on her. When several hours had passed and it was already completely dark outside, she took a bath in order to freshen up a little during all the time she had been lying unconscious. The girl thought about the situation that had developed all day and did not understand what kind of curse the Duke had mentioned then. She even assumed that the opportunity had done something when she saved Ryan. However, she didn't know if the curse that that man had cast on them could have been a curse. She, looking at herself in the mirror, realized that at that time they had absolutely no problems, and they suddenly decided to appear after so much time. Therefore, the girl considered this very strange and even suspicious. Eli suddenly touched the place where the man was holding her shoulder very tightly and realized that he was blindly strong, and some said that he was a skilled swordsman. But this did not matter at all, in her opinion. At that moment, a maid came into her room and said that she had brought the ointment that the girl had asked her for. Ellie immediately took it and thanked one for it, because she actually asked her for it, because she simply could not stand the pain in her shoulder any longer. Then the girl, having given the ointment, immediately began to leave, saying that, in her opinion, it was better to leave her alone. However, Ellie asked her to stay for a while. She immediately looked at her and asked if something had happened wrong. But the girl suddenly noticed her leg and asked if there was something wrong with her ankle on her left leg. She asked if it was true that there was some kind of dark spot that looked incredibly like an injury. Anna was aware of the fact that she couldn't lie, madam, so she just said it was just a bruise. She decided to look at it separately, so she didn't have to worry about it. Also lowering her head down, the girl said that if she didn't need anything else, she would like to leave already, since she needed to do some other work. Ellie began to object to me. Then the maid simply went out the door, closed it behind her, and when the girl was left alone, she felt some discomfort. The girl thought that something had clearly happened. It was very strange how the maid was fidgeting, and she assumed that it all looked as if someone had done something wrong and had been caught doing it. Soon, when night came, Elle fell asleep, and Ryan was sleeping next to her because he asked for it because he didn't want to be alone. However, the girl slept quite lightly, and as soon as she heard some strange sound in her room, she immediately woke up and turned to the other side in order to understand what it was. And then the girl saw that same servant Anna, who was carrying a candle in her hands and looked rather worried. The girl immediately sat up on the bed and quietly asked the maid what happened. As soon as the maid heard her voice, she immediately asked for forgiveness and said that she did not want to wake her up. Anna explained that she was simply trying to replace the candles while the girl was sleeping. However, because of this, she woke her up, and therefore the girl was incredibly ashamed. Ellie looked at her in surprise and immediately asked why she wanted to change the spark plugs at night. It was really strange. But the maid bowed and said that young Master Ryan had a very fragile body, so they always lit special herbal candles for him so that his health would not suffer during this time. But since the girl had already managed to replace everything, she said that in any case, it was time for her to leave and lived in Mrs. Goodnight. She quickly walked out the door. Of course, Ellie was incredibly surprised. She frowned and got up from her bed because she thought that something was wrong. The way the maid entered the room without permission and without making a sound, and the candle, which was practically new, all this was very suspicious. There was no point in changing these candles, since they were absolutely whole. But as soon as she took what the maid brought in her hands, she noticed that at first glance, there was nothing unusual there. Or she blew it out and thought that maybe it just seemed suspicious to her. However, she couldn't get rid of this terrible, unpleasant feeling that wouldn't leave her, so the girl just went to the windows and opened them. She decided to get some fresh air in order to calm her nerves, and she assumed that she should probably tell the Duke about this tomorrow. But as soon as the girl looked out the window, she saw some knights on horses. She was very surprised because it was already quite late and assumed that they could go to work. However, this was strange. Ellie knew full well that something bad could have happened, so she decided to go out and find out for herself. When the girl came out into the corridor, she immediately turned to the knight and asked if she could speak with the Duke immediately. Ellie replied that she had something important to do, so she couldn't just wait or put off this conversation. Some time passed from that moment, and the girl was indeed escorted to the Duke, who was completely displeased with being disturbed so late in the evening, and by such a person. He looked at the girl with disgust and said that he was incredibly surprised by the request for a meeting at such a late hour. But Kaiden wondered if it was something so incredibly important that he had to know it right then and there since she had called him. Ellie, as soon as she heard this, immediately became wary. She felt uncomfortable and even scared. The girl thought that because of such a tense atmosphere, her tongue was tied. She could not say a single word because her nakedness was striking, and she was simply afraid. She also didn't understand how she was supposed to convey the information to him so that he would listen to her and not again call her some kind of crazy person and send her back. After a long silence, the girl turned to His Highness and asked if he remembered how he grabbed her by the shoulder. The man didn't answer, and Ellie replied that she looked at her shoulder and it was now very badly damaged. Of course, she couldn't leave it all aside, so she called the maids to help her heal. But the man didn't even listen to her proposal until the end. He tossed her a small green box and told her to take it. Ellie looked at her in surprise and immediately asked what it was, and the man replied that it was medicine. The girl, hearing this, was very surprised and could not believe that he actually gave it to her just because she said that it hit her. He did not even ask for any proof. But at that moment, the man approached a small sofa and, sitting down on it, told her to stop saying useless things and get to the point, which is what she came for. Hearing this, the girl immediately realized that it just seemed to her that he had changed a little, but in fact, he remained the same idiot. But nevertheless, Ellie sat down opposite him and said that she came because the maid was acting very suspiciously. Kaidan, hearing the ominous sound, immediately asked if Liana was confused. The girl immediately said that it was not so. Her name was She, and she had short hair. Ile also said that she entered her room while she was sleeping and replaced the candle, which was practically new. There was still a lot of wax left before the end of that candle, and when the girl woke up, the maid looked too scared, like the one who was caught for some reason not good. The man at that moment sighed heavily and said that she had. After all, there were only suspicions and no evidence, so he did not understand how he should have taken her word for it. But the girl still asked him if it seemed to him that it all looked rather suspicious and very strange. Kaiden showed no interest and said that he was not at all sure about her judgment and did not find anything suspicious in those actions. Hearing this, Ellie was of course indignant and asked if his arguments weren't as superficial as hers. However, the girl understood perfectly well that their situations were not much different from each other, but he had already rushed to blame her and even come up with a punishment, so the girl did not understand at all why he reacted in this way to what she told him. Well, the man said that it was not at all like that for him. Everything was different now. The curse on her body was enough evidence for him to confirm his suspicions. Ellie immediately screamed loudly and asked what kind of curse he was talking about. She really didn't have much patience since she didn't know what he was talking about. But the man said in a completely calm voice that a magic spell had been cast on her, and it was a type of subjugation spell, a curse, which combined brainwashing for obedience and defeat. After this conversation, Ellie returned to her room rather quickly and was very upset because this man irritated her madly. And even after she explained everything to him, for some reason he still didn't believe her. Even for a moment, it seemed to her that continuing these attempts was a waste of time. She was very sad that since she ended up in that world, everything went completely wrong. And the girl could not understand why she had to transform into that particular story and into that character. She felt very sad about it. When the next day came, Ellie sat at dinner with the Duke and his nephew. However, she was not as happy as the previous time. She expected this, of course. However, when she looked at the Duke's indifferent face, her blood still boiled inside from the anger she felt. He still hadn't listened to a single word she'd said the previous evening, and so the girl didn't understand why she had to prove anything at all in the future. Because of this, she even lost her appetite. Ryan noticed this quite quickly, and seeing that she had stopped eating, immediately asked if she had finished her lunch already. Smiling, the girl said that this was indeed the case, and the boy, frowning, said that in that case he also did not want to eat anymore, because they were a team after all, and had to support each other. Ellie, hearing this, immediately smiled. She did not understand where he could have heard and learned such complex words, but she considered it quite sweet that he was trying to support her. The girl stroked the boy's head and asked him what he thought about them baking cookies that day. Ryan beamed with joy when he heard this and said that it sounded absolutely amazing.